The waves never stop. They beat against a beach near Huelva in southern Spain, a place called Punta Umbria. The sound was steady and forceful, wiping the sand clean of every mark and leaving behind only a dark, wet sheen. On the morning of April 30th, 1943, those waves delivered something that did not belong on any ordinary shore. Not a broken plank, not the usual driftwood, a dead officer. He lay face down, dressed in a Royal Marines field wool greatcoat and uniform, a yellow Mae West life vest strapped over the top. The tide nudged him in. With each pulse of surf, his body bumped the sand, once, then again, like a final awkward landing carried out by someone who could no longer stand. On his wrist, secured with a chain, was a standard-issue brown briefcase. Even after hours in seawater, the clasp held tight. The leather had darkened with moisture and looked heavy in a way that suggested more than water alone. The chain mattered. It turned the briefcase from luggage into evidence, binding it to the body so no accident of tide or curious hand could separate the papers from the supposed courier. Whoever planned this scene wanted investigators to see the briefcase as part of the man, not an object that might have washed in from somewhere else. Fishermen out early found him and raised the alarm. Local officials arrived quickly, along with a doctor and a Spanish naval judge. They rolled the body over with care. A young face stared back, pale, swollen from the sea, yet still recognizable in its contours. His documents identified him as Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. The doctor's preliminary conclusion was straightforward. An aircraft had crashed at sea and the officer had drowned. The locked briefcase and a document pouch hinted at the nature of his mission. Everything seemed to fit the familiar wartime pattern. An unlucky officer on sensitive duty, killed en route, his body carried by currents onto the shore of a neutral country. Regrettable but comprehensible. A neat ending. But this was not an ending. It was a carefully engineered colon, the opening of a deliberate suspense. Major William Martin had never truly existed. His heartbeat lived only in forged papers and an invented life. His death was the curtain rising on Operation Mincemeat. He and the briefcase chained to his wrist were a message delivered on purpose by British intelligence, specifically Naval Intelligence Division Section 17M and the London Controlling Section, the office responsible for deception. It was a letter addressed to the German High Command, with consequences measured in hundreds of thousands of lives. The surf kept crashing, indifferent. Salt and wind hung over a beach that had suddenly become strategically important. Beneath damp leather, above pages whose ink might already be blurring at the edges, a different kind of war had begun. A war that relied less on shells screaming overhead than on persuasion, detail, and credibility. Less on holding ground than on shaping the strategic map inside an enemy staff officer's mind. The briefcase was removed with ceremony and carried with the body to Huelva. By international convention, Spanish authorities would handle the Allied officer's remains and safeguard his property until a formal transfer could be arranged. The procedure was correct and solemn, yet almost at once the news moved through concealed channels to German operatives in Spain. A corpse carrying secret papers was, to any intelligence service, an irresistible temptation. The first and most basic question drifted on the Mediterranean breeze. What secret lay inside that waterlogged briefcase? And far away in London, what did the people who designed and delivered this package want the readers of that secret to believe? To understand why a body appeared on a Spanish beach, we have to leave that wet morning and return to London months earlier, to underground rooms thick with smoke and lined wall to wall with maps. The time was roughly January 1943. The North African campaign was nearing its end, and the Allies' next arrow had to point somewhere. On the map, the pebble at the toe of Italy's boot, Sicily, sat like a bullseye. Everyone understood Sicily's value. Control the central Mediterranean sea lanes, build a base for bombing the Italian mainland, create a springboard into Europe. But the target's obviousness was the danger. The Germans and Italians could see the same bullseye. They would fortify the island and pour troops into it. A frontal assault would meet the fiercest resistance at the beaches. Every yard of sand might have to be paid for in blood, at a cost Eisenhower, Montgomery, Patton, and other commanders could not accept. German planners could shift reserves quickly across their Mediterranean defenses. If they guessed the landing site correctly, they could concentrate armor and seasoned infantry at the decisive point and strike the beachheads before they hardened. The Allies did not need the Germans to be weak everywhere. They needed them to be uncertain at the crucial place for just long enough. So a cold problem landed on the desks of Britain's secret war planners. How do you persuade the Germans that Sicily is not the real objective, and not the only one? How do you pull their tanks, their elite divisions, and their defensive center of gravity away from Sicily and towards somewhere else? Rumor would not do. The Abwehr and the German General Staff were no amateurs. They had multiple sources and a habit of cross-checking. What was needed was not a single vague lie, but an entire chain of evidence, a coherent, detail-rich alternative reality that could survive scrutiny. Like the best magician, you do not crudely cover the audience's eyes. You guide their attention until they reason their way to the conclusion you have already prepared. That was the soil in which Operation Mincemeat grew. Its planners, key figures including Charles Cholmondeley and Ewan Montague, stood over maps and began drawing a false arrow. They asked themselves again and again, from the German point of view, aside from Sicily, where would the Allies most likely strike, and what would most unsettle them? The analysis pointed to two critical areas: Greece and Sardinia. An attack on Greece could drive into the Balkans, threaten Germany's Romanian oil lifeline at Ploiești, and align politically with the Soviet Red Army on the Eastern Front. The implications were immense. An attack on Sardinia could provide a better springboard for an assault on southern France, or toward the heart of Italy itself, arguably a greater threat than Sicily. Both targets offered the sort of strategic imagination that could make Berlin see danger on multiple fronts, and both tugged at Hitler's long-standing fear of flanks and resources. So the core blueprint took shape: create high-level secret documents implying that the next major Allied offensive would be aimed at Greece and Sardinia, while any action against Sicily would be limited, a diversion intended to distract and fix Axis forces. But what to say was only the start. The harder question was how to say it, and who would say it. How could documents at that level plausibly fall into enemy hands? The plan needed a perfect vessel, a plausible accident, a convincing courier. The ruthless, efficient idea surfaced. A staff officer carrying ultra-sensitive papers dies in an air crash at sea. His body is carried by currents to the shore of a neutral country where German networks are active and pro-Axis sentiment is strong: Spain. There, the papers have a strong chance of reaching German hands through unofficial channels. The gears meshed. Wrap a carefully crafted strategic lie inside a real, undeniable human tragedy. Use a genuine, inspectable corpse to give counterfeit papers the weight of truth. The target was not the sentry on the beach. It was the generals and analysts in Berlin staring at maps and reports. From that moment, Operation Mincemeat stopped being an idea and became an engineering project, and the unnamed courier became its most critical and most morally complicated component. The blueprint was set. The project moved into its most creative phase, giving the yet-to-be-chosen body a complete human life. William Martin could not be just a name and rank pinned to cold skin. If German intelligence examined him closely, he had to feel like a living man, with relationships, habits, and emotional ties. A single awkward detail, a single blank spot that did not fit the logic of ordinary life, could become the crack that collapsed everything. This work was less forgery than character creation. The planners had to build not only credentials, but memory. First came the official shell: identity papers, military tags, combined operations headquarters passes, and routine correspondence. Each item was crafted with meticulous care. The paper stock was right, the stamps looked used, subtle formatting quirks of different offices were copied. He was made a major on the staff of Combined Operations Headquarters, senior enough to plausibly see sensitive plans without being so prominent that his existence would be impossible to fake. But the real artistry was the pocket litter. Pocket litter is a quiet science. The paper must be right, but so must the wear. Soft corners, believable creases, and smudges that look earned rather than manufactured. Dates must align. The story must survive a hostile clerk who notices what month it is, which theatre plays on which night, and how much a ring costs. If any one scrap feels too perfect, the whole life begins to feel like a costume. They gave him a private life. He had a fiancée named Pam. A photograph of a blonde young woman labelled Pam sat inside his wallet, its edges worn and slightly creased as if handled often. A receipt from the Bond Street jeweller, J.B. Wilson, recorded the purchase of an engagement ring on April 19, 1943, for £53, the kind of detail that feels too mundane to invent. 2 love letters from Pam were folded and refolded until the creases looked natural. The handwriting was affectionate. The tone mixed impatience with hope. Small complaints about separation, small dreams about what they would do when the war ended, and small jokes that sounded like a real couple trying to hold a private world together. They gave him family and social ties. A short note from his father, sent from the Carlton Club in London SW1, carried the gentle concern of an older man. With it came an overdraft notice from Lloyd's Bank, Oxford Street branch. Martin's account was overdrawn by £79, 19 shillings and 2 pence. That small financial embarrassment was not a weakness. It was a masterstroke, the sort of believable imperfection that makes a stranger feel real. A flawless life can look staged. A minor mistake looks like life. They gave him ordinary movements and pleasures. A torn theatre ticket stub dated April 22nd from the Prince of Wales Theatre in London for a show titled The Birth of Love. Keys on a ring for a flat at 47 A Aldini Street, London SW1, and for an office. In his pockets were half a box of matches, a London bus ticket, and a few loose coins that could have come from any ordinary day. Each item worked quietly. The more an investigator handled these scraps, the less room there was for suspicion that someone had staged the entire scene. They told a coherent story. A young British officer in love, slightly careless, carrying serious responsibility, rushing from London toward North Africa on urgent duty, then dying at sea. It was real in the most dangerous way. Real enough to feel unremarkable, real enough to make deeper doubt seem cruel. And then, among the clutter, came the papers that mattered. A most secret private letter from General Mountbatten to Admiral Cunningham, commander in the Mediterranean Theatre, and a formal memorandum from Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Nye to General Alexander. They were placed in the briefcase alongside the love letters and receipts. The contrast between domestic intimacy and strategic gravity made the documents feel even more authentic. Their importance felt unplanned, the way real life stacks the trivial beside the decisive. One more detail helped justify why the courier would be travelling in the first place: a note asking the Admiralty to help return an expensive privately purchased pistol to Britain, suggesting unfinished personal business and a hurried departure. When official and private details snapped together, Major Martin lived. He was no longer a code name or prop. He had a plausible network, a plausible pattern of life. And because his invented life felt so ordinary, his death felt like fate rather than design. The papers he carried became harder to doubt. The last step was delivery. Late on the night of April 19, 1943, in the Scottish port of Greenock, the Royal Navy submarine HMS Seraph slipped out under cover of darkness. Its orders were strange and deliberately vague. Carry a special hydrographic instrument to a designated sea area and deploy it. Only the captain and a handful of officers knew the truth. The object loaded aboard, a cylindrical metal canister roughly 6 feet long, held not an instrument, but a corpse. Major William Martin, with his possessions. The canister was packed with dry ice to slow decay and preserve the appearance of a death at sea. The canister was lashed in the cramped interior, a silent passenger the crew were told not to discuss. In ordinary submarine life, everything is mechanical and immediate. Valves, depth, soundings, orders. Here the mission carried an unsettling intimacy. They were responsible for preserving a corpse long enough to be found, and for preserving the illusion wrapped around it. Even in wartime, that felt different. Seraph travelled like a silent steel sea wolf, diving and running towards Spain's southwest coast. The voyage carried a particular pressure. Space was tight. Air was stale. The knowledge of what they carried changed the mood. The crew were ordered to keep quiet and avoid talk. The submarine sounds, the low hum of motors, the hiss of water along the hull, the steady drone of ventilation filled the silence. They were not delivering a weapon to destroy an enemy ship. They were delivering a story meant to persuade an enemy mind. After 10 days at sea, in the darkest hours before dawn on April 30th, Seraph surfaced at the planned coordinates, about a mile southwest of the mouth of the Huelva River. The sea was relatively calm. A light breeze stirred it, clouds muffled the moon. The conditions were perfect. The canister had been designed to take on seawater slowly, sink and open automatically, releasing the body so it would appear to have drifted from a downed aircraft or ship, floating for a time before washing ashore. There was no ceremony. The canister slid into black water with a small splash and vanished. Seraph dove at once, turned and disappeared, as if it had never been there. The rest was surrendered to forces no one could fully command. Currents, tides, wind, and the most uncertain element of all, human behavior. As the planners hoped, events followed the script. Within hours, the body washed onto Punta Umbria beach and was found by fishermen. Spanish authorities moved quickly. The corpse was taken to Huelva under the supervision of the naval judge Don Jose Vasquez Rey. The initial autopsy conclusion matched the cover story, drowning after an air crash at sea, and the locked briefcase was immediately recognized as a potential intelligence prize. Spain was neutral, but its politics were complicated. Pro-German factions were strong inside parts of the military and intelligence services, and the Abwehr operated actively. Huelva, an otherwise unremarkable port, became a quiet stage for competing loyalties. By the rules of neutrality, Spanish officials formally safeguarded the body and effects and notified the British naval attaché in Madrid. On the surface, everything was proper. Underneath, information travelled fast. Word reached the German deputy consul in Huelva, an Abwehr agent named Adolf Klaus. A dead Allied officer, a locked briefcase, the possibility of high-grade secrets. Few opportunities are so clean. The next days were the operation's most fragile and its most revealing. The briefcase was held legally in a safe, but German interest pressed hard. Later accounts and files allow a plausible reconstruction. Under discreet pressure and a shared understanding, Spanish officials allowed German operatives to inspect the contents. They likely avoided smashing the lock. Damage would be too obvious. Instead, they used skill to open it without clear traces. In a secure room, the documents were removed one by one. German specialists, very possibly Klaus himself, and Spanish officers looked on. Paper whispered. A camera shutter clicked softly. Every page was photographed from multiple angles. The crucial Mountbatten letter and Nye memorandum, but also the love letters, receipts and ticket stubs whose domestic intimacy reinforced the illusion. The order of the papers mattered, even the folds. After photographing, the documents were returned exactly as they had been found, the briefcase closed, and the official posture of neutrality maintained. It was a silent play with no spoken lines because each party knew the stakes. Spain maintained a public posture of neutrality and procedure. Germany, through unofficial means it could never publicly admit, obtained what it wanted. The film moved quickly through development. Photographs went to Madrid, then to Berlin by diplomatic courier or encrypted cable. The deception's core had been planted inside the enemy's intelligence machinery. In London, the planners could only infer what was happening from scraps and intuition. They knew the arrow had been loosed. They did not know whether it had struck. Like hunters watching a trap from far away, they waited for the small click that would mean success. The bait had been swallowed. But had it hooked? Deep in the Admiralty's old building, or in an unremarkable room at Bletchley Park, the air felt heavy. Ewan Montague, Charles Cholmondeley, and their colleagues entered the most punishing phase of secret work, waiting and verification. The operation had crossed the sea. What they needed was the echo of impact. For days, there was only routine news from British diplomats in Spain. The body was found, identity checks underway, effects in Spanish custody. Good. Expected. But the crucial unknown remained. How deeply had the Germans penetrated the case? Had they seen the documents? Had they believed them? Or had they dismissed the entire thing as an obvious trick? They could do little but recheck their own construction. Was Martin's background airtight? Did the pocket litter's dates and logic survive reverse analysis? Were the documents' tone and classification pitched correctly, serious enough to be valued, not so polished that they smelled staged? In deception, a tiny seam can become a tear. Their only true window was Ultra, the Allied ability to decrypt high-level German communications, including many Enigma messages. Monitoring units were instructed to watch for anything linked to Mediterranean defense, Greece, Sardinia, Sicily, an Allied officer's body, or captured documents. Waiting became a hunt for fragments in radio traffic. Then the fragments arrived. First came messages about William Martin himself. Decrypted traffic showed German intelligence urgently activating networks in Britain to verify him. Names, unit details, personal traces, exactly the kind of inquiry the planners had anticipated. The answers German agents found matched the manufactured background with remarkable consistency. Each confirmation, each note that details checked out, added weight to the papers in Berlin. Then came strategic signals. Communications between the German High Command and the Southern Theatre Command increasingly discussed a main Allied blow in Greece or Sardinia. A Luftwaffe intelligence assessment dated May 14th reported that Spain had yielded an absolutely reliable source revealing Allied intentions. Other messages showed German analysts calculating shipping requirements and plausible landing sites for an invasion of Greece, treating the scenario as a matter of timing rather than possibility. Finally came what mattered most: movement orders. Decrypted traffic indicated German leadership was reshaping Mediterranean defenses. Hitler showed particular anxiety about Sardinia and the Peloponnese. Orders followed. Elite forces originally intended to reinforce Sicily, including full armored and well-trained infantry formations, had their rail movements altered and their destinations redirected toward Greece and Sardinia. The Luftwaffe was instructed to strengthen reconnaissance and defenses over these regions, and German troops began strengthening positions in Greece, including defensive preparations at the Corinth Isthmus, the narrow neck that controls movement between mainland Greece and the Peloponnese. When London's planners saw the pattern, anxiety drained into exhausted relief. There was no cheering. A long exhale was enough. The enemy had not only believed the story, the enemy was acting on it, shifting real divisions and real steel across real rail lines. A document now held in the UK National Archives, reference HW20/546, shows internal discussion of how to distribute a report on German perceptions of Allied Mediterranean objectives, and it notes that this perception had been seeded through Operation Mincemeat. Deception had become a measurable input into the enemy's decision system. On German maps, the arrow of danger was being pulled away from Sicily and pointed toward Greece and Sardinia. That shift did not guarantee victory. It only altered the opening conditions. In war, even a brilliant deception can fail if the opponent recovers quickly or if weather, logistics, and sheer fighting power overwhelm the advantage it buys. Yet the redirection mattered because it forced the German command to live with competing possibilities, each demanding scarce resources: rail capacity, air cover, shipping, staff attention, and the limited pool of trained troops. Every hour spent reinforcing the wrong coastline was an hour not spent strengthening the right one. The planners in London had aimed for that, to impose a decision problem on an enemy that preferred certainty and to keep uncertainty alive, while the real invasion was already underway. But maps are only paper. The real test is always the first fire on the shoreline. Operation Mincemeat brought an opportunity, a brief window of misdirection. How wide it opened and how long it lasted would be measured on Sicilian sand. Everyone involved understood that the final receipt would be signed in July 1943, during the landings called Operation Husky. On the night of July 9, 1943, the Mediterranean turned unexpectedly rough. A vast Allied fleet of more than 3,000 ships using bad weather as accidental cover approached a 160-kilometer stretch of Sicily's southern and southeastern coast. Nearly 160,000 British, American, and Canadian troops were aboard. The atmosphere was heavy. Everyone knew what dawn could bring: coastal guns, interlocking machine gun fire, anti-tank obstacles, and a textbook German armored counterattack. Veterans of North Africa remembered what happened when attackers stalled in the surf. The sea state and the wind scattered some landings and complicated coordination, but it also obscured the approach. In the confusion of darkness and weather, what mattered most was not elegance, but momentum. If the first wave survived long enough to unload men, radios, and ammunition, the beachhead could begin to harden. If they failed, the next waves would find only wreckage. In amphibious war, the margin is often measured in minutes and in the speed with which defenders decide where to commit reserves. In the early hours of July 10th, the assault began. In wind and surf, soldiers dropped from pitching landing craft, waded through chest-deep and sometimes over-the-head water, and lurched toward dark sand. Gunfire tore open the night. Tracers drew brutal lines. Explosions threw up dirty columns of water. Resistance was fierce. Italian coastal divisions fought better than expected in some sectors. The German units on Sicily, including the Hermann Göring Armoured Division and the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, were elite. Combat turned white-hot. The beaches became a furnace. Yet as daylight came and the picture widened, Allied commanders noticed something odd. German counterattacks, though violent, were scattered, poorly coordinated, and above all, short on decisive weight. The expected hammer, multiple armoured battalions and infantry formations striking in a synchronized blow during the first hours, did not arrive. In many sectors, the Allies gained a firm foothold and began pushing inland. Why? Where had the hammer gone? The answer lay in the strategic map Operation Mincemeat had warped. While Sicily roared with fire, decisions in Berlin, in Rome, and within the Southern Command were trapped in a fog the British had engineered. The papers supposedly carried by Major Martin lodged like a splinter in the mind of the decision-makers. Could this be the diversion the documents described? That doubt haunted the chain of command. Hitler, especially, leaned toward the belief that Sardinia or the Peloponnese was the real target. On July 10th itself, an assessment by the German High Command warned that Sicily might be a holding action and urged caution in committing strategic reserves while the main blow could still fall elsewhere. The critical decision, whether to rush reserves, especially armoured formations, from southern Italy and southern France into Sicily for an immediate counterattack, was delayed in part by that lingering suspicion. The Hermann Göring Division could have struck earlier and more concentrically, but parts of it were at times held back under orders to prepare for redeployment. Reinforcement efforts by sea and air were also reduced by uncertainty about Allied intentions and by Allied air superiority, which narrowed options and increased the cost of every move. This was Operation Mincemeat's most direct dividend. It did not make the enemy vanish. It made the enemy hesitate at the wrong moment. It bought the Allies the most valuable currency in war: time. In the most fragile first 24 to 72 hours, Germany failed to assemble enough force for the coordinated counterattack that might have decided the campaign. By the time German leadership confirmed that Sicily was the main target and ordered an all-out response roughly after July 12th, the best moment had passed. The beachheads had linked, men and supplies poured ashore. Allied air dominance held firm. Germany fought fiercely afterward, inflicting heavy casualties through stubborn defense and controlled withdrawal, including classic delaying actions around the approaches to the Strait of Messina. But the initiative could not be recovered. On August 17th, the last Axis troops evacuated Sicily. The campaign ended. In 38 days, the Allies controlled the island. Military historians point to many factors behind that outcome: sea and air power, logistics, experience, Axis fractures, morale. Yet serious accounts rarely omit this. The Allies' crucial advantage in the opening phase, tactical surprise and relatively weaker initial resistance, was shaped in part by Operation Mincemeat's deception. It acted like an invisible buffer at the moment of impact, absorbing and deflecting some of the counterattack that might otherwise have crushed the beachheads. With paper, imagination, and a corpse, the Allies changed the opening geometry of a major campaign. When the first Allied scouts stood on Sicilian ridgelines and looked back toward the coast, they did not know about a body on a Spanish shore. Yet their foothold and the survival of many was linked in a real, if unseen way, to that distant lie. As smoke thinned over Sicily and Allied flags rose at Messina, the files of Operation Mincemeat were stamped most secret and locked away. The participants' achievements remained unspoken during the war and for years afterward. Major William Martin was buried with full military honors in Huelva's San Marcos cemetery, his headstone carved with the name and identity he had been given. Only much later did his true origin surface, a Welsh drifter named Glyndwr Michael, who died after ingesting rat poison. In that transformation, one anonymous death was recruited into a larger drama, and the line between honoring the dead and using the dead grew painfully thin. The deception is now widely regarded as one of the Second World War's most successful, bold, and consequential strategic operations. It entered intelligence textbooks, inspired literature, and has been reimagined for film and television, until it became legend. But when the dramatic dust is brushed away, what remains is a colder lesson about war and about cognition. We often measure power in steel output, tank formations, aircraft counts, and millions of soldiers. That is physical weight. Operation Mincemeat revealed another kind of weight: cognitive mass, informational potential energy, the leverage of narrative applied to reality. One body, a handful of documents, a few personal scraps, light enough to fit inside a briefcase, produced effects that moved far heavier things. Once the story was accepted by a specific system, the German intelligence and decision system, it triggered a chain reaction. Rail schedules rewritten, divisions shifted, strategic focus redirected, and with it, the density of fire, the width of breakthroughs, and the survival chances of thousands. This was the weight of paper. When information is built into a model that looks sturdy, lifelike, and self-confirming, and then injected into the gears of an enemy's decision cycle, it can act like a lever, moving realities far heavier than itself. It is a psychological intervention that reaches down into the physical world. It also exposes a cruel rule of high-level deception. To fool a smart opponent, the lie must feel more real than the truth. It must be nourished by credible details with the smell of ordinary life. It must exploit human habits, the reverence for accidentally obtained intelligence, the instinct to trust domestic evidence, even the respectful procedures surrounding the dead. It is a war without smoke, yet no less calculated, no less unforgiving. Return then to the first image, a Spanish beach and the waves that never stop. Long ago they erased every trace of that spring morning in 1943 as if nothing had happened. Yet we can imagine other sounds folded into the surf, the faint scrape of a briefcase being opened, the soft click of a camera shutter preserving a lie, and far away on Sicilian sand, the silence of certain deadly guns that did not fire when they might have. Operation Mincemeat's final echo may be the question it leaves behind. Before the thunder of guns, is war already partly decided in another dimension, between maps and intelligence reports, between an analyst's inference and a commander's resolve, between the stories we are willing to believe and the truths we fear to face? There, the most effective weapon is sometimes not explosive yield, but a well-structured story model, credible enough to pass as reality. And the strongest defense is sometimes not concrete fortifications, but a clear-eyed mind that can spot the fracture at a story's core. So when a document, a message, a narrative is placed before us and claims to reveal a vital truth, the last question, perhaps the one that matters most, is not, is it true? But, after it convinces me, what does it want me to do? The waves never stop. They wash over secrets and lies, and they wash over the forever blurred boundary between the real and the invented.